As you see it on our card, if we hover over it, the size immediately changes. So there is no transition, no smoothing of this increase in size effect. Typically, when adding such transformations though, you want to have a specific transition, a specific way of how the initial state of your element transits into the, well, transformed state, so to say. And for this, we need CSS transitions. One note before diving into these: the code required to implement the transition is applied to the initial state of the element, not on the event triggering the transition. This means, by going back to the code, instead of adding the transition logic to our hover pseudo-selector here, so this is the so-called triggering event, we hover over the card container, then something should happen. The transition has to be defined in the card container here in our case, so in the default state of this card container. Because only by defining the transition initially, it can be applied once the triggering event, so the hover effect, comes into play. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. You define the transformation, so the transform property, on the state of the element that transforms it, whereas the definition of the transition happens in the initial state. You'll see this in a few seconds, of course, how it works. It's just important to keep this difference in mind. Now, back on the slide, we can now have a quick look at what such a transition looks like. This is basically a complete definition of a transition. As you see, transition here to the left, written in white, is another normal property, just as transform was. But this property is a so-called shorthand containing 4 different key areas that define a transition. The first area is the orange one here. This is the so-called property. In our case, we have the transform property because for our project, we want to add a transition to the transformation of our card container, so here to the increase of the size of this card container. You can also add different properties here though. For example, we could also say that once we hover over a certain element, the background color should change. We see this, for example, here on our button. If I hover over here, the background color becomes blue. And there we could also add a transition. We will also have a look at this, of course, but the idea here is that the property definition here has a value in the transition property, can be based on different properties. Transform is just an example here. The second value we can define in this shorthand is the so-called duration. Well, as the name indicates, how long should the change of the property defined in the first position here take? The third value to define is the so-called timing function. Timing function here is set to ease out. That's not the default case. Ease out here simply means that the transition starts fast and ends slowly, so ease out. Ease in, on the other hand, would mean that the transition starts slow and then builds up speed. The default value here would be ease. This would be an evenly distributed transition period. You don't have to define this, therefore, but you can do so, and we will also do so. The last value to define is the delay. So this simply means if I hover over the element here in our example, should the transition be immediately executed and therefore also the transformation in our case, or should it have a delay that we can define right here in seconds? This is how transitions work in theory. Let's now add this transition logic to our existing transformation on the hover effect of the card container. For this, I'm back in the code, and as I said, in contrast to the transformation, the transition has to be applied to the initial state, so here to our card container class. For this, we add the transition property. As I said, it's a completely normal property that we have. And the first thing to define is the property that should be affected by this transition. And therefore, I emphasize that we have to define this transition property on the initial state of the element. Because here we want to define the transition of our transform property that we use for our hover effect on the card container class. So in contrast to the transform property here, which we define when the triggering event, so this hover effect, comes into play or takes place, the transition property has to be defined for the element that wants to use this transition later on. So here, for example, for our transform effect. Of course, this effect would then also be available for nested elements. So if we want to add a hover effect for the H1 element, for example, further down, this would also work. I'll show you this a bit later in this lecture though. So in our case, we want to define the transition of this transform property. This means we cannot define the second value in this property, which was the duration of this transition. And for this, I'll take a very long value of 2 seconds now, just to demonstrate this feature. Now we have the timing function. So if the transition should start fast and end slow, or the other way around, or it should be evenly distributed. If we don't define anything here, ease would be the default case. But we can also use something like ease out, for example. With that, it would start fast and end slowly. We'll also do this here. And finally, we can optionally add a delay, for example, of 1 second here. I'll keep this for reference. We might get rid of that delay though in a few seconds. With this, we implemented the transition with all our 4 values. So the property it refers to, the duration, the timing function, and the delay. And by going back to the project, and by hovering over our card container, you see that initially nothing is happening, and then we have a fast start but a slow ending of the transformation. If I go back and maybe increase the scale to 10% here, so 1.1, then it should become even more obvious. So let's change this and let's go back then. And now I hover over the card, nothing happens. Now it starts fast and fades out slowly, so to say. So you can see it. If I move away, it has a slight delay, then it becomes small. Again, if I hover over it, it starts fast and ends slow. For this, we can actually also get rid of our delay. I don't think we need this here. And also, the period is way too long. I'll just go with a value of 0.5 seconds here, because this makes it, well, a lot smoother actually. And by the way, you can also find more information about the transition property and also about these different timing functions we have attached to this lecture. So let's go back once again and let's see what this looks like. Yeah, I think this looks all right. Actually, we can even make it a bit smaller from the scale size. So let's also go back to 1.05, so 5%. As mentioned before, we can also use this transform effect, including the transition, on other elements which are nested into the card container in our case. So for example, if I go down now to the H1 element and here add a hover pseudo class and basically cut out the transform property from our hover effect for the card container and paste this here. If I now go back, then by hovering over our H1 element, can you see it? The effect also takes place. So this is what I meant before. You have to define this transition logic on the element you want to use it on. But this also can be used then for elements nested into this element where the transition was defined. Well, in our case though, we can actually cut this out again and add it back to the card container hover effect, and we can also get rid of the H1 hover selector here. Before we finish our transition and transform logic though, there is one last thing that I would like to show you, and this is this property here inside the transition property. As mentioned, we are using the transform property here for our purpose, but we can also use other properties. For example, instead of transform, we could say that we want to change our background color. So we add this property here. We can then quickly comment out our transform property for the hover effect, because now instead of transform, we want to use the background color property for this transition. So we could say that the background color here, so we just use the normal property, should change to yellow, for example, which won't look good, but it will show you easily how this works. Now, in our project, if we hover over our card, you see that the color changes with this transition. Can you see it? It's not an immediate change, but it has this nice transition effect. If I would go back and comment out the transition in the card container, now save this and go back once again. If I now hover over the card, the color changes immediately. And this doesn't look as smooth as it does with the transition being added. Let's go back though, and let's comment this in here. And let's change the property back to our transform property. And let's also delete the background color change in our hover selector here. And let's comment back in the transform property. And by now going back to the project, you see that everything is as intended again. What you could do now though is you could add the same logic we just had for the entire card, so changing the background color, to our button here. It's just a very small exercise, but with that you can quickly practice how this transition logic works. Therefore, now is your chance to pause the video and to quickly implement this logic, so make sure that the color change here is a smooth process, not this direct color change that we have at the moment. So, how did it go? Could you solve this little task? I hope you could. Let's quickly implement this on our own now. So let's go back. And here was one little trap, which you hopefully didn't fall into. I hope you didn't add the transition property here below our card container class selector. Because if you would add something like transition and then whatever here, then, well, the cascading logic of CSS would, well, kick in. And with that, you would override your transform property up here. So if you would add the background color property, like this, and then 0.5 seconds, for example, and ease out like we had it for the transformation. Then by going back to the project and by hovering over the card, well, then the transition is gone. So if this happened to you, be careful. Don't forget about the CSS principles we learned about in this course so far. So let's go back again to the code and let's cut this newly created part out now. And now we can go down. Where to? To our button class, this one here. Here we have to define it. As I said, we have to define the transition property on the initial state of our element. So here the transition property can be added. Now we refer to the background color property, which we use here for the hover effect. And with this in place, and by going back, you now see that we have the effect for the entire card container. And we also have it for our background color change of the button. So this was the little challenge, and this was it with transformations and transitions. As I said, these are the basics to make sure you can use these concepts as part of creating your layout, your look of the website. Therefore, attached to this lecture, you can find more information about these topics, because we will dive into the logic behind these little icons here now.